All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 13, Section 2, Antebellum Communal Experiments. So one thing to reiterate with this chapter is the massive changes going on in society that really prompt some of these movements and reforms. We already talked about the Industrial Revolution, how steam power replaced natural forms of power, how that led to changes in manufacturing and transportation. We didn't really talk too much about the market revolution, so just kind of in short, the market revolution was a change in the way that really farmers lived. Typically, before the market revolution, farmers typically, grew their food, or we might say grow to consume. So the idea for a farmer in, let's say, 1790 or 1770 was to grow enough food to survive. Well, thanks to trains, the idea is to grow to sell, right? And this is, in short, what the market revolution is about. It creates an economy within the United States, where you have, the rural areas. And of course, in the rural areas are the farms. And then, of course, in the urban areas, we have the rise of the factories, the mass production of goods, and linking these communities together, and this is what makes the market revolution possible, are railroads, right? So we might say trains are sort of the missing link here. And so, farmers then provide things like food to the cities. They get money back, and in exchange, they can just pretty much buy stuff. So it's kind of the emergence of this internal economy. So they're related to one another, but they're affecting kind of different parts of the country. We'll just go ahead and kind of mark off this this illustration here as being what happens in the market revolution. And one of the things about the market revolution was that it could lead to a higher material standard of living, but it also came with some downsides. Farmers that made the switch from growing to consume to growing to sell often found themselves in a much more competitive environment, a dog-eat-dog type of world, sink or swim. So for some farmers, this was great. They made a lot of money, but a lot of other farmers went out of business because now farming became a competitive aspect. So that's going on in the rural areas. Of course, everything we talked about with the Industrial Revolution is going on in the urban areas. So like we said, this created in many ways a new society and new problems, right? New problems. And a lot of people believe that, these new problems were, very, very bad, and that there needed to be a complete separation from American society. Most people are just going to look to reform, right? Change kind of some of the things in society, but there are some utopian groups, in this case, we'll be looking at religious utopian groups, that almost want to take extreme or radical measures to recreate society. So we might say of utopian societies, they want to recreate in a radical way, right? Radical way. And we'll just sort of list a couple of examples of these various societies. Now, in terms of ones that are influenced by religion, we do have to recall that the Second Great Awakening, which we talked about in section 13.1, is sort of underlying all of these things. So church membership is skyrocketing. People are going to church much more. The emphasis on individual salvation, et cetera, et cetera. Some of these societies were just purely religious societies, either pietistic societies, keyword being piety. That means to stress, all right, piety above all, sort of religious, what's important in religion. And the Rappites, who are also, you might just call this a pietistic society. These were just some of the earliest and more popular religious communities that were completely insular. In a lot of ways, they were also communal. They, in short, sort of, rejected the notion of like private ownership and private property, and instead lived in a much more kind of communal but separate way. Some of the more notorious utopian societies include the Shakers and the Oneida community. The Shakers, who you see pictured right here for performing this dance, that's where they got the name from performing this dance, lived in communities where men and women refrained from sexual intercourse. So it was not allowed, we also use this term celibacy, right? Celibacy or complete celibacy was required amongst the Shaker community. Men and women typically lived separate from one another, would come together and perform sort of this bizarre dance where they would shake all around. People called them Shakers. This was sort of one extreme in order to, create society in a new way. The belief that refraining from any sort of sexual intercourse would be the solution to all those problems. In the Oneida community, they sort of took things to the opposite extreme. The Oneida community, whose leader was John Humphrey Noyes, we'll call him the leader. They were maybe a more notorious group because they believed in the idea of a complex marriage. And that meant that pretty much every man and woman was quote unquote married to each other and free to have sexual relations. So in this case, instead of, pure celibacy like the Shakers did, in the Oneida community, any man and any woman could engage in sexual intercourse, and that was perfectly fine. The Oneidas, they were not seen as positively as the Shakers. They were often required to move, often prosecuted under various adultery laws, etc., etc. So in this cases, in looking at groups like the Shakers and the Oneida, in terms of their radical views, they're really looking at something like the monogamous marriage and saying, that's something that needs to be changed or altered in order to create a more better or perfect society. However, the most successful of the religious movements during this era was the founding and the growth of Mormonism. Right? Mormonism, we might call this the most successful religious society. Mormonism was founded by Joseph Smith. We'll call him the founder and leader of the Mormons. Joseph Smith was someone who lived in the Northeast during the transition, during the market revolution. And so that transformation from, again, farming to consume to farming to sell created a new society, new problems, instability. And, Joseph Smith was visited by the angel Moroni, who revealed a prophecy to him, which was later on, which would become the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon, we'll call this the text of the Mormon religion. Oops. Mormon religion. I think I spelled that wrong over here again. Let's erase that. Religion. And one thing that Joseph Smith and Mormonism really emphasized was the idea of placing the father figure sort of at the center of the household. Mormons also preached a message of order, in kind of the chaotic world that was going on with industrialization, with the market revolution. The Mormon church was very orderly. It was very structured. It was trying to reimpose that on society. And also to bring a closer connection between state and church, especially during the early 1800s and leading up to the Civil War. There was a very strong separation of church and state, and some people believe that maybe wasn't the right way to go, considering what was happening in places like industrial cities, and maybe there needs to be a community in which the state laws are the church laws, and that's what Mormonism provided. So these things were very attractive, and it was one of the reasons as to why the Mormons were the most successful of these communities. However, they did face persecution from their, fellow citizens. Joseph Smith's insistence that he had sort of the right version of Christianity compared to everyone else. It was also very controversial when some high members of the Mormon Church practiced polygamy, that is, having more than one wife. And Joseph Smith and the Mormons, although a rather large group, found themselves constantly having to move from one place to another. They ended up in Illinois, where Joseph Smith was killed by a mob. And so leadership passed to Brigham Young. We might say he became leader of the Mormons after Smith. And they looked to move, the Mormons did, very far away from any type of persecution where they could freely practice their own religious beliefs, but also their own community, right? This wasn't just attending church on Sundays, but it was a whole society in which there was a much closer connection between church and state. And so they moved to Salt Lake City, Utah. This is sometimes called the Mormon Trek or the Mormon Exodus. Salt Lake City, Utah would be the city that the Mormons moved to. And even today in 2021, Utah as a state has a very large Mormon population. Mormonism is, spread much further beyond Salt Lake City and Utah, but you certainly still have that kind of historical imprint there, dating back all the way into the 1800s, or at least the antebellum period, let's say, that Mormons moved to. So there were some, a variety of various efforts to create these different sorts of religious societies, all sort of radical in a sense of trying to fundamentally change some of the, sort of core beliefs in American society at the time. There were also some utopian societies that were secular, that did not really stress religion. One of them was Brook Farm. Brook Farm was more of an intellectual community. We might say this is also somewhat related to the Transcendentalists. Transcendentalist movement. One such famous member of Brook Farm was Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was an author. He was a member of Brook Farm. It was very small. It was only like 100 people, right? So it was just a group of 100 intellectuals that, engaged in sort of scholarly, questions and criticized society, sort of sought to separate themselves from mainstream United States. They wrote a newspaper called The Harbinger. See it right here. Another good example of a secular utopian society is that created by Robert Owen. Robert Owen was a Scottish factory owner. And you might look at Robert Owen as kind of an anti-capitalist. He was really sort of put off by the way that workers were, wage slaves, in the words of some, that there were pretty horrible working conditions, workers were exploited. Robert Owen created factories that paid well, in which workers lived at the factories, had some of the basic needs provided for, and they were still productive. He brought his experiment to the United States, to New Harmony. New Harmony, we might say, was an experiment in, we'll just call it communal factory system, right? Where, people worked a reasonable 8-hour workday. They had everything that was essentially provided for them, given that they weren't paid a wage. But ultimately, infighting led to the downfall of the New Harmony settlement. It failed in the long run. But, people who sort of saw labor and, the system that, the factory system and industrialization brought, called themselves Owenites. We might say that these were followers of Robert Owen, right? So at least in some cases, when we talk about the utopians, right? Utopia, if you're not familiar with this word, means kind of like a perfect world, right? Almost, it's almost like it can't exist, right? It has to be so perfect. So, these, societies, whether it's talking about the economic system like capitalism or a legal system like marriage, trying to challenge those sort of fundamental aspects of society, not a lot of people are on board with that. Most people are simply looking to keep capitalism, keep marriage, but simply reform society to make it better.